Here we are again, thank goodness we get together for Writers Read. And today we have two writers, Gordon and Ann Irish. Excuse me, Gordon, I should say your last name. Gordon Orians. And Gordon has talked about leaves today. And I want to thank Gordon for the ending comment of the recent Residents' Council meeting when he shifted our attention to seagulls after that meeting and talked about seagulls. Gordon, I hope you can do that at the end of every Residents' Council meeting. Come up with a little
I've had so many people stop me in the hallway and say, what happened to the gulls?
Yeah.
So I thought this was a perfect time to tell everybody.
After a complicated meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, but first of all, you know the routine. We say Paul Niebanck's poem together. I say a line, and then you say a line. Right, right, right.
Right, right, right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
Welcome, welcome. Now, Gordon, I wrote you an email earlier this week, and as I thought about your introduction, I wondered about if you were a writer early in life. And then I started to think about scientific writing and whether there's a difference between storytelling and scientific writing. But do tell us how you got started in your writing.
Okay, well, science writing is also storytelling, like everybody other kind of writing, but it's also a special art form designed in a certain way for a certain audience. And so it's a particular kind of communication, and we all get used to it. But I had a lot of experience with that, but actually this book that I'm going to read from, Snakes, Sunrises, and Shakespeare, I originally wrote it as a science book. One of the reviewers for the press said, this is an interesting book, but it could be more interesting if it written for a broader audience. Ask Orians if he's willing to do that. And so I did, and I rewrote it.
Oh my.
And it was really hard. Really hard. One of the hardest things I've ever done. How successful I've been, I don't know, because it's a different style. So the book as it stands now is written for a broad audience. It's not written, I'm not trying to speak to other scientists. Whether I've succeeded, only time will tell.
Only time will tell. Okay, Gordon, tell us the title one more time so we get those 3 words in our mind.
Okay, the title of the book is Snakes, Sunrises, and Shakespeare, How Evolution Shapes Our Loves and Fears. Shall I give you the backstory for this?
Yes.
I worked as a behavioral ecologist, working mostly with birds, and looking at the main decisions that all organisms have to make to get along in life, how to find a good place to live, how to modify it, how to find food, how to avoid being food for somebody else. A certain set of decisions that all sorts of organisms have to make and make successfully if they're going to survive. And I thought about it, and well, our ancestors in the East African savanna made the same decisions. I wondered if I could, as an evolutionary biologist, then appropriately modifying the process, get an understanding and see if I could see whether where we lived in the African savanna, where our brains tripled in size, we know that, and we became human, whether there's a legacy in our current behavior today that reflects where we lived when we became human. So that's what the book is, the result of my exploration of that.
Thank you, Gordon. You may begin.
Okay.
Looking forward here.
Okay. What I'd like to do is to give you a few selections out of the book that give you a flavor of what is done, a flavor of how you can actually do this. Doesn't this sound sort of strange to figure out, do we have a legacy from the African savanna? Is there any real way to test that? I will show you, yes, there is. And I'll finally try to tell you that look, we've learned some things from doing that, some insights about ourselves that we would not have figured out if we hadn't done this. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to start by reading the opening story of the book, because it kind of introduces how interesting the findings might turn out to be. Our African ancestors must have found honey a sweet temptation. It was nutritious, delicious, and easy to digest. But bee colonies were uncommon on the African savanna. In order to find and exploit them, prehistoric hunters relied on an unusual partner that also benefited by leading them to the hives. The partnership has persisted into the modern times, leading them to the hives. We can still witness it today and see East African tribes, and among these are the Boran of northeast Kenya. Before settling off in search of honey, a Boran honey hunter gives a specific loud whistle known as the fulido call. If they're in luck, there will be a return call from a bird with a fulido call of its own. The caller is a greater honey guide, a small bird whose Latin name indicator reflects its value to humans. The honey guide repeats this call and excuse me, follow me call, and begins to escort the Boran hunters to a bee's nest, pausing frequently to allow the hunters to catch up. Most astonishing, upon arriving at the tree where the bees have nested, the honey guide perches and sings a special indicator song. The bird remains nearby as the humans disperse the bees and claim the prize of honey. In gratitude, they always leave some honeycomb behind. Unlike most birds, honey guides can digest wax, but honey guides are too small and too weak to open bees' nests. They depend on hunters to do it for them, and just as people depend on honey guides to help them find the bees' nest. When I first heard this, I didn't believe it, and a lot of people didn't believe it. This could not be true, but some German scientists actually went and filmed it and did it all, and it's true.
It's true.
So that, and this indicates the kind of deep relationships that we have with the environment. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story. So I opened the book with that, and I thought I'd open my discussion with you with the same story, because it's a lovely, lovely story. So I want to get, why is it reasonable to expect that what happened thousands of years ago really affects who we are today? That's the underlying hypothesis, and I want to read a couple things that sort of help guide you to why that makes any sense to do this at all, because it might seem to be kind of crazy. Really, you're going to think that what happened thousands of years ago really makes a difference to who we are today? And the book is all about yes, it does. In this book, I share with you the result of my personal odyssey to understand our emotional responses to nature and how scientists explain them. Our emotional roots lie in the African savanna, back where we first followed honey guides to a sweet feast of honey, while keeping an eye out for lions that might dine on us. We will examine how an understanding of our evolutionary history helps explain why we respond emotionally, why the reasons for our responses are often hidden from us, and how our brains evolve to make decisions that improve our survival and reproductive success. Understanding these emotions is particularly important today when we live and respond emotionally in a complex environment that differs dramatically from the one our ancestors. Sorry about this.
No, you get always stuck.
Yeah. Oh, come on, page.
Gonna get.
It's gonna
There
get,
it
there we
is.
go.
There it is.
Our ancestors lived in atoll very recently. I will also explore how experience of our emotional responses influence both what we do to the environment and as well as what the environment do to us. So that's sort of the rationale for doing this. And I want to show you that, well, you can actually study this, you can actually do science, which might seem kind of difficult. So I want to take a little glimpse here that worked out some of the work that I did. This book involves the research of everybody, it's just not mine. But I'll give you a little bit of thing that I did on the shapes of trees and the importance of tree shapes, which is something I've been interested in because trees are such an important part of how the environment looks and our response to the environment. We really turn on or turn off depending on what they're like to trees. And this is a little section called Seeing Through Hominid Eyes. Every time we look at an object or scene, we see it through the eyes of our hominid ancestors, unconsciously assessing what we could do with or in it. We may also evaluate the consequences of those actions. We ask of an object not only what is it, but what's in it for me. How easy would it be to enter that environment, exploit, and find my way back? What would I gain? Is that tree a source of fruit, refuge from predators, or a lookout post? A river might be a source of water, a channel to move along, or an obstacle to be crossed. Flocks of birds and herds of mammals might indicate an environment rich in game. Without our being aware of it, our nervous system is busily filtering incoming data, suppressing or enhancing information, checking the accuracy of perceptions, and evaluating information. Because our modern lifestyle has arisen in a mere blink of evolutionary time, we all do this with brains adapted to the African savanna. So, the trees offer multiple benefits, you know. Trees can indicate resource richness. They can also offer safety. The closer to the ground a tree trunk divides, the easier it is to climb. A dense tree provides good shade, but also visually, view from the canopy is poor. To test if these traits influence attractiveness, Judy Heerwagen and I recorded people's responses to photograph of Acacia tortilis, a common species in the resource-rich East African savannas. It often dominates safari advertisements. We selected photographs of individual trees that varied in height to width ratio, height at which the tree trunk divided, and extensive canopy layering. We grouped them so that one category, trunk height, canopy density, or canopy layer, varied while the others did not. We asked participants to rate each tree on a continuous scale. 1 to 2 equals unattractive, 3 to 4 moderately attractive, 5 to 6 very attractive. Participants could score a tree as 3.6 rather than 4. We recorded ratings of 70 people entering or leaving the University of Washington bookstore and 30 in a restaurant on the University of Washington campus. They ranged in age from 18 to 60. We approached people and asked them if they would be willing to fill out a questionnaire on the role of trees in environmental aesthetics. Instructions the survey read. The attached photos questionnaire will ask you to rate the relative attractiveness of a number of trees. There are 6 trees on each page with a rating scale under each. Circle the point on the scale which best corresponds to your opinion of the tree's attractiveness. They were asked to rate the trees on each page before they continued and not to look back once they had proceeded. We tested them. We created 4 hypotheses to test from this. Trees, 1, trees whose trunks divide closer to the ground should be more attractive than trees whose trunk divide higher up. And this is what one of those pages looks like.
Oh my, can you get that?
We did a bunch of these. Okay. They're nicer than the original. Trees with moderate canopy density should be more attractive than trees with low or high canopy density because you could see better from them. 3, trees with high canopy layering should be more attractive than trees with low to moderate layering because layering is a very prominent thing in East African trees. And 4, the broader the tree's canopy is relative to its height, the more attractive it should be. As we predicted, tree trunk height, canopy layer, and wide canopy positively influence people's attractive scores. Contrary to our predictions, however, the canopy width to canopy height ratio did not influence the tree's attractiveness. So the point is, we were able to test something, and one of the predictions was wrong, and that's important in science, that you have predictions that you can reject. Mm-hmm. And we all learn something from our mistakes, but we don't like to have to, but that's the way it goes. So this is a little incident that just is entitled to, or included to, provide an example that you can actually draw some predictions and test them in ways that you can accept or reject. And as you know, scientific hypotheses are good only if they are capable of being rejected. And we rejected a couple, so that's how science goes, okay?
Yeah.
And so we did, what I'm trying to say, we actually did some science, okay? And I'm a scientist, so for me that's pretty important. So I'd like to now give you some results without going through all of this. What do we learn from all this? And what do we learn from everything that all the evolutionary ecologists, evolutionary biologists have done? Have we learned anything about this that helps us understand what I would call our savanna legacy? Some of the responses I have discussed were already well known, but evolutionary psychology has shed new lights on the way why we have them. Consider, for example, our attraction to water. Evolutionary psychologists have shown that infants and toddlers on their hands and knees mouth flat, glassy objects as if drinking, suggesting that our positive response to water is innate. Some of our other responses that we have uncovered as a result of evolutionary psychology are that we have, and here's some results, hardwired attractors, autonomic nervous system circuits that respond strongly to animals that were relevant in the past, dangerous snakes, herbivores, and large carnivorous animals, than to stimuli that pose a greater threat today. Firearms, electric wires, speeding cars, they're much more important. Second, strong responses to pointed forms that resemble the fangs, saws, and forms of dangerous animals. And there's a variety of experiments that show that we respond very strongly to pointed forms in various forms. Automatic and unconscious association of sickness with food eaten hours earlier, and negative responses to likely sources of contagion, such as rotting flesh, and signs of infection, such as pus. This implies an intuitive microbiology that evolved long before we were aware of the existence of microorganisms or had a germ theory of existence. We didn't know about any of these things. Our ancestors didn't know about anything, but there's an intuitive microbiology. We learned to avoid things that were actually good to avoid. Although our evolutionary psychology has enriched our understanding of those things we already know about, its greatest value has been to help us think about responses and patterns that we would have missed completely or failed to imagine without an evolutionary perspective. Among the surprises that have been discovered are the following. Women remember better than men the location of high-quality food in the supermarket. Good for you. Yeah.
Good for you.
We have a previously unknown and unsuspected vertical illusion. We dramatically overestimate vertical irregularities in the ground. This is extremely important. We did a lot of running. And if you trip and fall, there was no 911 to call in those days. And if you broke a leg, that was probably fatal. Mm-hmm. So we have, our visual system exaggerates up and down stuff. Prospect refuge theory, which I didn't describe yet, explains our unconscious emotional responses to unfamiliar environments. That is when we're motivated to explore, but environments that are unfamiliar are very dangerous. You don't know what you're going into. And there's a lot of research that I described there that describes how we relate to exploration of unfamiliar environments. The savanna hypothesis predicts new explanations for our preferences among tree shapes and the way we manipulate trees in parks and gardens. And I did a lot of studies of garden trees and how we manipulate them, and working in Japanese gardens, which is all manipulation of tree shapes.
Mhm.
And what the Japanese do to pines and maples and make them look more like savanna trees. They do that. We are especially attracted to changing colors of leaves on flowers. Changing colors of leaves. We love flowers, we spend millions of dollars on flowers, and it works. Why? Evolutionary psychology is offered, and I have a little chapter on flowers that says that's why it works.
Oh my.
Our neural systems are more accurately detect changes in the position of animals than of objects, even cars and other motor vehicles, by far the most deadly moving things in today's environments. And we have special neural mechanisms tuned to the tessellated kind of pattern that occurs on the back of snakes, which is a pattern that's not found in anywhere else in nature. We have all sorts of very interesting emotional responses to that pattern. And snakes are a big deal, and often have a big deal in humans. So that's just some examples of some of the things we've learned, and I described these and how we figured them out in the book. So let me close with the final paragraphs of where I think this has taken us, and this is called Environmental Aesthetics and Progress. We understand more about how the world works than ever before, and our knowledge grows exponentially. Unfortunately, this accumulation may not make us more sensible. As Edward O. Wilson suggested, we are drowning in information but starved for wisdom. Applying results of environmental aesthetics may help improve human well-being, but ethical and political judgments may lag behind. History tells us that knowledge mostly increases power. It has little influence on rationality or morality. Our needs and emotions remain basically the same. The major decisions made by our ancestors during the Pleistocene are the same ones that we must do today. Yet improved understanding of ourselves that evolutionary psychology has given us can be a source of inspiration. An evolutionary perspective offers a rich and rewarding view of what it means to be a human on Earth. Following Charles Darwin's leads, we have developed a new perspective on life on Earth, its origin, and how the millions of species we share our planet with came into being. Evolutionary psychology has also given answers to the deep questions people everywhere have asked. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? We now employ evolutionary perspectives to think creatively about the challenges our savanna ancestors faced, how they evolved to deal with them, and why their responses have left important legacies in our modern minds. We understand why we have important legacies in our modern minds. We understand we have a sense of beauty and awe, and why emotions drive our decisions. We have much more to learn, but we can be certain that an evolutionary perspective will continue to yield new and interesting insights into our interactions with the complex environment we live in. Most reassuring is the good news that most of the things we like to do are good for us to engage in. Evolutionary mirrors has told us why that is so. Only a few animals, elephants and apes, recognize themselves in a mirror. Human beings have reflected for a long time, but we have an increasingly deeper understanding of the nature of the savanna ape, whose reflections we review if we take time to look. If we look carefully in the mirror, what we can see: a boron hunter whistling for a honey guide, a spreading acacia tree casting a welcome midday shade, and out of the corner of our eyes, a python hiding in the grass. We can recognize both our current selves and the savanna environment with its challenges and opportunities that molded us. It is a comforting view. We can and should take pleasure in contemplating this inspiring glimpse of ourselves as a part of the unfolding life on Earth over nearly 4 billion years.
4 billion years. Oh, Gordon, thank you so much. You always inspire all of us to want to know more. But here's my challenge. Why don't you design a scientific experiment using us to respond to something?
That gets too personal.
That won't work.
No, well, yeah, I am using you right now.
Oh. Oh, thank you so much. And this book,
It's in the library.
It's in the library on the back shelf.
Yeah.
And I hope it's cataloged. Do you know?
It is cataloged.
Okay.
And so you can check it out. You can also still buy it.
Is there that information?
And it's available in paperback, but
Yeah.
in truth, it has not sold well.
Yeah.
It's not been a bestseller. And
Yeah, is that right?
I've tried, I don't know why, but this has been an inspiring trip for me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
Thank you
Gordon.
very much.
3 cheers. More than 3. Welcome.
As you were
Ann
talking.
Irish. So looking forward to this. And earlier this week, I wrote Ann an email and invited her to share what her early writing experiences were. And I am quoting your response because I just found it delightful. When I asked if she started to write stories when she was younger, she says, "Of course I wrote stories. Didn't everyone?" And I just love that response. And welcome. How did you start your writing at an early age?
Well, I read books.
Yep.
And if you read books, I think you think about writing books yourself.
Mhm.
If you're a little kid and don't know very much.
Oh, that's a wonderful
And-
connection.
Yeah, and nothing really came of them. And, you know, I tried writing this and that in somewhat later years. But the first stuff I ever had published was while I was a school teacher.
Oh.
And I had 2 articles published. Isn't that
Bravo.
exciting?
Bravo.
One was about the 18-year-old vote, and I wrote this shortly after the Constitution had been amended, so 18-year-olds could vote, and I was teaching senior high school students.
Oh.
So what I wrote was, let's get out the 18-year-old vote.
Oh.
And the other one I wrote after I'd been an assistant English teacher or resource person in Japan for a year. And it was called Why Japanese Education Works. And I had written it and given a copy to the superintendent of my school district. And then to my surprise, it ended up being published in the National Association of Secondary School Principals Bulletin. Isn't that
Bravo
exciting?
again. Bravo again.
Well, eventually I retired. And then I thought, what am I going to do now? I'm going to write a book. Finally, I'm really going to write a book. And I'd done research on this subject in graduate school, so that helped.
Yeah.
But of course, I didn't want to waste a summer out here doing research and sitting in libraries and so on. So the first day of school in September in my district, I got on an airplane and went to Nashville, Tennessee, which was the center of the district in Congress that my subject lived in. And yes, he was my grandmother's second cousin, but later he became Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, which is why he deserved being written about.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful background to your reading
And
today.
that's why I started writing. That was it. That was the
Good.
beginning.
Okay, let's see this book.
Okay, this is the second book I wrote, The History of Hokkaido, which is Japan's northern island. And you need to know a few things which maybe you already know. This takes place in 1848 and a few years after that, and it actually happened. On Hokkaido is the population called Ainu, who are the Aboriginal folks in Japan. They're not ethnic Japanese.
Oh.
And it's like the Native Americans here, the white folks here, the Japanese in Japan didn't think much of these other folks, you know. They didn't matter. Anyway, it's similar. And their lifestyles have been similar in a number of ways too. The capital of Hokkaido in those days was a town called Matsumae. Now the location of the island, right north of it was Russia. And the Japanese were a little bit scared of what Russia might do. but there it was. And Sakhalin was the name of the first Russian island there. If you go to the south end of Japan, you come to the city of Nagasaki, which you probably heard of. And the reason it matters is that in those days, Japan was closed to foreigners. The government would not let any foreigners in, and if somebody came, they incarcerated him. I'll say him, probably there weren't any hers, who knows? And got them down to Nagasaki as soon as they could.
Oh.
Because once a year, one ship was allowed from a foreign country into Nagasaki, and that was from the Netherlands. And yes, they could do a bit of trading, but they also had to take any foreigners away. That was part of the deal. Finally, I use the word kombu because it's in here, which is a kelp or seaweed used in foodstuffs. All right, the name of this is Ronald McDonald's Adventure. In June 1848, a group of American seamen found themselves imprisoned in Japan. These 15 men, including 8 from Hawaii, fled in 3 small boats from the New Bedford, Massachusetts whaler Lagoda under Captain John Finch after it struck rocks near Matsumae in the fog. Evidence suggests that the men were anxious for an excuse to escape harsh conditions on board and thus deserted at an opportune moment. Not badly damaged, the ship returned to its home port the next year. After 2 days, the 15 men reached a small village where they received water, but not food, and were not allowed sleep. As soon as possible, village officials gave over their prisoners to Matsumae officials. These men gave the sailors rice and firewood and commanded them to depart, but they soon landed again on the Japan Sea coast several miles north of Matsumae. Here the men refused to leave, indicating that their boats were too small to handle the ocean and that their ship had foundered. From then on, the castaways were kept under guard. Held near Matsumae, several of the men fled, but on recapture were placed in secure confinement until they agreed not to escape again. This group was sent to Nagasaki, arriving September 2nd. Here they were accused of spying, partly because of their attempts to escape. Unruly behavior and unsuccessful attempts at flight led to confinement in what they charged were inhumane conditions, and several of the men died. Hearing of these men from Dutch officials in Nagasaki, American officials in China dispatched a ship to Nagasaki to rescue them. After applying some pressure, American envoys succeeded in arranging the men's release. That's a bit of background.
Fascinating.
An unusual adventure ensued when a brave and curious young American made his personal attempt to penetrate the closed nation of Japan. Ronald McDonald, born in Oregon to a Chinook Indian mother and a Scots father, shipped out on a whaler and arranged a seeming accident off the Japan Hokkaido coast. He had been intrigued by the adventures of 3 Japanese who had drifted all the way across the Pacific Ocean after their ship had foundered off Japan in 1832, finally reaching land at the area now the northwest corner of Washington state. He wondered whether there were a racial connection between American Indians and Japanese. And even though he knew that Japanese policy kept foreigners away, he determined to go to Japan, partly for the adventure, but also to learn about the Japanese people. One of his shipmates wrote that MacDonald thought that he could perhaps learn the language, and as an interpreter, do his part to help develop trade between Japan and America. In pursuit of his dream, Ronald McDonald shipped out on the whaler Plymouth, and in 1848, 24 years old, he carried out his plan. The Plymouth at the time was just west of Japan's northern peninsula, and on June 27th, MacDonald left in a 27-foot boat, arranging things to look as though he had been shipwrecked. He managed to maneuver his craft to tiny Yagishiri Island. He stayed there 3 days, having brought some provisions to sustain him. He met no one and thought the island uninhabited, though a small Japanese settlement then existed on the opposite shore, out of sight. Since, apparently, no Japanese had spotted him, and his goal was to meet Japanese, he left the island, sailing north to intercept another island he saw in the distance, which he estimated to be some 10 miles away. This would have been Rishiri Island, actually some 45 miles from Yagishiri. As he arrived at Rishiri, Ronald MacDonald purposely overturned his boat to add credibility to his tale of foundry. 4 Ainu men in a boat, stroking their great beards, met him. Once MacDonald was on shore, some 100 people watched the action on the beach as the young American was taken up to the only large house in sight, where a Japanese official, not an Ainu, met him. The official offered MacDonald dry clothes, a gown, and food, fish, pickles, preserved shellfish, and ginger, as well as grog, yes, which turned out to be sake. MacDonald wrote about later learning that the earlier survivors, when proffered sake, had answered, grog, yes, fetch it on, and thus the Japanese official called sake, excuse me, grog, yes, for the foreigners' benefit. MacDonald remained on Rishiri Island for several weeks. Visited by Ainu leaders interested in all his possessions, he began making a list of words from the Ainu language. Carefully, he observed everything he saw. For example, he realized later that while Japanese worshipped at altars in their houses, the Ainu did not. The Ainu, he reported, really loved sake, but always offered a bit to the gods before partaking of it themselves. When he returned to America from Japan, he found that people were very interested in the Ainu. It was only on Rishiri that he had much contact with them, and he wrote, "To me they seemed a simple, kindly people, and I shall ever gratefully remember their Samaritan kindness to me." He also noted that they appeared dirty and unkempt in comparison with the clean, refined, and cultivated Japanese. Several days after MacDonald's arrival, a group of Rishiri men went to report the Americans' presence to the nearest military officials at Soya, Japan's northernmost cape and about 30 miles across the sea. For a few days, MacDonald waited for the return of the party. Meeting a Japanese on Rishiri who wanted to learn English, MacDonald began studying Japanese. He made a pen from a crow's quill in order to compile a vocabulary list. One day, his informant, whose name MacDonald remembered as Tangaro, secretly showed MacDonald a map of Japan. The visitor was impressed at the details shown on the map, but remarked that it showed 2 islands, where Western maps showed 1. Apparently, the maps used on the ships MacDonald had served on showed Sakhalin and Hokkaido as 1 island, whereas the Japanese map, more accurately, included Lapurus Strait between them. The emissaries to Soya returned, accompanied by Japanese officials, who questioned MacDonald in detail and studied all his goods with care. They walked him to a house in another village some 3 miles away. Here, for a month, he was confined in a room some 12 by 12 feet, allowed out of it only to bathe. and that just 3 times.
Wow.
Next, 3 samurai escorted him to Soya, an 8-hour journey across the water. Soya obviously was a military port, MacDonald could see, for many soldiers were about. Clearly, the Japanese were apprehensive of Russian aims. As soldiers marched Ranald MacDonald to his new prison, buildings along the route were all hidden by curtains, just as on Rishiri Island. He was taken to a specially prepared room, or cell, in Soya's official building, and again all his belongings were carefully inspected. Once again, MacDonald's prison proved temporary. After about 2 weeks, he was taken to a fairly large junk and allowed the freedom of the ship as long as he behaved. MacDonald found that this vessel carried a cargo of kombu and salted fish. As the junk cruised southward, sailing just offshore toward Matsumae, MacDonald had a chance to look at Hokkaido's west coast. The boat put into shore just once during the voyage in order to replenish its water and wood. After 15 days, a long time for the distance due to unfavorable winds, the ship arrived at Matsumae September 7th, 1848. MacDonald was instructed to stay out of sight during docking. Here, officials more splendid than any MacDonald had yet seen boarded the junk and took the prisoner ashore, maneuvering through crowds of boats. Once on land, MacDonald traveled to his new prison in a sedan chair, curtains drawn. Not until the middle of the night did his procession reach its goal, a town he noted as Eramets, some 10 miles north of Matsumae, and probably today's Era village. He estimated that Eramets had about 50 houses. To MacDonald's surprise, he discovered that the room where he would now be confined had been the prison for other Americans. His Japanese host pointed out names, including John Brady, written on a beam, and said the word American as he gestured. American, who knows? The men had been the escapees, and they had moved on just a month before MacDonald was brought to this room. The plan was to send him on to Nagasaki as soon as possible, but the need to make arrangements to repair the junk which would take him there, MacDonald understood, led to a 3-week stay near Matsumae. Again, the Japanese treated the young adventurer leniently, though he was definitely a prisoner. He received ample food, rice, fish, kombu, pickles, and clothing, Japanese robes and trousers. He was watched while he ate, and before he took a bite, an official taster tried the food. During MacDonald's confinement here, he was allowed to read only his Bible among the several books he had, and he was given permission to do this only because he indicated it was a religious work. Finally, MacDonald was escorted to the nearby shore, where a boat took him out to a large armed junk. On this he sailed October 1st for Nagasaki. He noted the grand ceremonial crowd attending his departure from Hokkaido, military officers wearing armor and common soldiers in colorful formal attire as his boat drew up anchor in a harbor he estimated full of 1,000 boats. And as MacDonald departed, the officer who had been in charge of him presented him with some apples. Thus ended his adventures in Hokkaido. Because of MacDonald's imprisonment, he had seen little of Hokkaido, and this continued in Nagasaki. Here, though, one attendant was a samurai, Moriyama Inosuke, who knew a little English. Though MacDonald was kept confined in Nagasaki, he gave daily English lessons to 14 Japanese, including Moriyama. In April 1849, more than 6 months after he arrived in Nagasaki, Ranald MacDonald was released in order to leave for America, and he met the Lagoda group, who were still confined. MacDonald blamed the Lakota men for their own troubles, later writing that they were young, violent, habitually quarreled amongst themselves, and gave much trouble. They all left Japan together on the American ship Preble. Ronald MacDonald did not accomplish all his desires during his sojourn in Japan, but he played an important role in the developing relations between Japan and America. His polite manner and friendly interest in the people he met may have helped make possible his school for interpreters. His students became the interpreters for the Perry expedition to Japan several years later, as well as for the first American resident consul in Japan. There has been a suggestion that the Japanese treated Ronald MacDonald sympathetically because his half-Indian heritage meant he did not look as foreign to them as did other Westerners they saw. His story is told in a textbook used in Japanese junior high school English classes. And today, there is an organization called Japan Friends of Ronald MacDonald, with members both in the United States and Japan. Just a few years after Ronald MacDonald's adventures, Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry made his history-making voyages to Japan and gained credit for opening up the reclusive land. The Japanese decisions made after Perry appeared led to great changes in all Japan. As American settlements in California and elsewhere in the West grew, the Japan trade beckoned. Missionaries and others who felt that the spread of American civilization would benefit Asia were also eager to open Japan. In addition to these motivations, the U.S. Navy, whose ships were changing from sail to steam at the time, was anxious to develop a number of coaling stations around the world for refueling. In 1853, the U.S. dispatched a powerful expedition led by Commodore Perry to make a serious attempt to open trade. Thus, in July, 5 years after Ronald MacDonald's adventures, American ships approached Tokyo, and Perry submitted a letter from President Millard Fillmore urging that Japan be open to trade with the United States. The letter also requested the opportunity to reprovision American ships in Japan, and, perhaps most important, pressed Japanese officials not to imprison foreign seamen rescued off Japan. Perry then withdrew his fleet, indicating that he would return the next year for the Japanese response. Perry's ships, Japanese called them black ships, returned in February 1854, and the government, feeling there was no choice but to accede, reluctantly agreed to open Japan a bit. In the previous decade, Britain and France had wrested privileges in China, and the Japanese knew that Russians in ships nearby had the same concern and wanted to come to Japan. The proposed treaty made 2 ports accessible to American ships for fueling, provisioning, and dealing with emergencies: Shimoda on the east coast of Honshu between Tokyo and Kyoto, and Hakodate on Hokkaido. The treaty also included provisions to ensure that shipwrecked foreigners could no longer be incarcerated while in Japan. The government in Hakodate was hard-pressed to meet the new demands that resulted from the foreigners. Not the least of these problems was the need for interpreters. The Hakodate leader soon notified Nagasaki, along the foreigner center in Japan, of his problem, and one man who was then sent to Hakodate to act as interpreter was Iwase Yashiro, who had been a student of Ronald MacDonald during MacDonald's detention in Nagasaki. I'm not quite done. When I went to foreign places, I kept journals, and I found the journal that I wrote in 2004 when I was in Hokkaido. working on finding stuff to eventually write this book. And I took a subway, and at the end of that line was a sort of memorial building or tiny museum for an American who had been in Hokkaido in the middle of the 19th century to advise the government on how to grow food on that northern island where it was much colder, especially in the winter when they had lots of snow, than the Japan lands the people there were used to using for agriculture. And he did a very good job and stayed for many, many years. There was a nice woman who let me in, and she was the only attendant there. And after a while she came and asked if I would like to have tea with her when I was done looking at things. Well, of course, I said yes. And we chatted. Among other things, I was telling her all the ways in which Hokkaido history should be interesting to Americans and Canadians. When I got to Ronald McDonald, she got all excited because she's a member of FOM, Friends of McDonald, and took a trip with the group to Oregon and Washington several years ago. They went to Astoria, where McDonald was born, of course, but also to his burial spot in northeast Washington state. I asked her why she was so interested in McDonald. She said, because she was born on Rishiri Island, where he had met the Ainu. Her family is no longer there, but she said she had a good childhood there and implied that it's mostly tourism that keeps the island going now. I finally left after a lovely time.
Oh, bravo. Oh, and what an experience you had. And then writing this book. Tell me about the cover. Can you tell what you chose to have on the cover?
Well, actually, the publisher did it.
Oh,
I
see,
think they did a
that's
lovely
what I
thing.
hear, that the author doesn't get to do that.
Well, sometimes the author did, and I had a hard time working with the current publisher of the book that will soon be published, and I'm not sure. Anyway, this is the symbol for Hokkaido, this particular star, and you'll see it, I think you'll still see it on bottles of Sapporo beer, perhaps.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
Sapporo.
Yeah. And this is an Ainu home. It was a postcard,
Okay.
probably beginning of the century. And here are Ainu baiting a bear. Bear baiting was an important ritual.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And this, of course, is the island. And down here, let's see, is Japan's main island, which we went on. And Russia is right up here.
Right there.
And here is a view of of a park in the middle of Sapporo, which is the biggest city there in the capital. And the idea was to have this empty land with no buildings for sort of fire protection in case they ever might need it. And I don't think it's had to be used that way, but there it is. It's a lovely park for many, many acres.
Hokkaido. No.
And this book is in the library.
Great, great.
Yeah.
And thank you so much.